Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to the Rockets Launch Pod, presented by Clutch Fans. I'm your host, Ben DuBose, based here in Houston, and I'm again joined by Paulo Alves, my good friend, co-host, and producer out of Portugal. You can follow me on social media at Ben DuBose, Paulo at Paulo Alves NBA, and you can read my work covering the Rockets at USA Today's Rockets Wire and over on the Clutch Fans blog at clutchfans.net. With training camp in the books and the preseason officially underway, we do have a lot to talk about today, but I want to start by addressing some housekeeping items because you've come to know us as the Logger Line over the past few years, but that's no longer the case since, as mentioned, we've got a new name. Karbach is phasing out Clutch City Logger. That's obviously their business decision. It's way beyond my pay grade. And so because of that, it no longer makes sense for them to be the main sponsor. And if they're not going to sponsor the podcast, then there's no reason for our podcast to be named after a beer since we're talking about Houston Rockets basketball. So we've got a new Rockets-themed name, but it's one that also has a few personal connections for us as well. Paulo used to host the Launchpad podcast back in the day, and then Sports Talk 790, of course, the flagship radio station of the team and our primary distribution partner for the show, they've got a pregame show known as the Rockets Launchpad. So since we're a 790 podcast, it only makes sense for this to be the Rockets Launch Pod. And then as far as partnering with Clutch Fans, obviously Dave Hardesty has been a massive figure in the Rockets content community for decades. He's been a frequent guest on this show, a friend of the program for some time. And so as I see it, it's only fitting that we work a bit more closely with him. So not much is going to change as far as the program itself. The main show is still going to be me and Paulo basically yapping about the latest games, the latest rumors, and pretty much everything else that comes with the territory of being a diehard fan of an NBA team. If anything, we'll probably just have a bit more content. As some of you may have noticed, if you're a subscriber to the RSS feed, in recent days, Dave and I have been doing these Clutch Fans Live YouTube sessions right after each game. The idea is to have something a bit more quick-hitting, 30 minutes or less, just recapping what we saw on the floor that night. There's also a bit more of an interactive component in that we can respond to some of the live questions and comments from you all that are streaming it live with us. Those episodes are getting live streamed over at the Clutch Fans YouTube channel, which you can subscribe to, but I'm also posting them to this channel once each episode wraps up. I don't know exactly how frequently we'll do those. I don't think it will literally be every game, but I do think it's something new that we want to try out from time to time, because to say the least, when your team acquires Kevin Durant and becomes a championship contender, it then becomes a lot more fun to talk about them. And as far as that show and the concept, it won't just be me and Dave. Paulo, I think you'll be on from time to time, as well as other friends of the program that our regular listeners are probably familiar with already. So, long story short, the long-form podcast that you're used to from me and Paulo, that's basically staying the same. No major changes here. We've just got some cosmetic and business things that we're changing up as far as the name, the sponsor, the logo, stuff like that. And then we're going to be sprinkling in some mini episodes from the new live show on the RSS feed. All right, with those disclaimers out of the way, let's get right to it. Our listeners have probably heard my thoughts already from those aforementioned live shows. So, Paulo, I'm going to let you take the reins today. Rockets are 2-0 in the preseason, home wins this week over Atlanta and Utah. Still got two more games next week, exhibitions that is, against the New Orleans Pelicans and Atlanta Hawks. Paulo, what has stood out to you most in these two games, the first full week of October, and what questions do you still have as we look forward to the back half of preseason play?
It's been definitely a very interesting couple of games for a lot of good reasons, and then a couple of not so good reasons as well. Obviously, it's preseason, right? And it's not even the phase of preseason that they call dress rehearsal or whatever it may be. It's not even like within preseason, it's not even the serious part of preseason yet, right? So, I'm going to talk a little bit about, effort level on defense and stuff like that. But I think the biggest takeaway from, I think we can go player by player, but I'm going to give a biggest takeaway from a team perspective already. Both in the game without Kevin Durant and the one with Kevin Durant, I think it was even more noticeable then. The biggest theme I have is just how much smarter or how much higher the basketball IQ seems to be from everybody across the board, right? Last season, from every player on the court, like we saw a lot of, boneheaded mistakes, hesitation, not really, of really knowing how to press advantages at times. And my biggest takeaway from the first couple of games is that it seems like guys are a lot crisper in the passes they make, in the decisions that they make. I can give you a couple of examples. There's obviously the fast break between Tyrese and Alperen Sengun. I think it would be very easy, and I think any Rockets fan from last year looked at that play and from the beginning was like, okay, Tyrese bringing the ball up, Sengun's trailing him. There's like four Jazz defenders. There's a fairly likely scenario that this doesn't end up in points. And I think if you look at last season, that's not like we were a good fast break team because we got a lot of fast breaks, but we weren't necessarily the best decision makers. And that was, that fast break was run to perfection. Tari, drew all of the intention, and then last second, while providing a safe pass, Bastol Chingun got the easy dunk. At that point, there's obviously the fast break with the four-man fast break that basically everybody touches the ball, and then that's ends up with a man Thompson to Jabari Smith Jr. Alley-oop, like the spacing, right? No, or kind of the positioning of the players on the fast break to try and maximize the space and guarantee that whoever has the ball has multiple options. So it's harder for the defense to defend. Like that situations, like I think it was very, very noticeable the gravity that Kevin Durant had in the game that he played. Like Alperen Sengun had, I think, 13 assists in a game where he played under 30 minutes. I think you can very easily tell that, yes, Sengun has matured, and we'll talk about Sengun in specific. But before I get into, each player individually, I think a lot of those 13 assists was the Rockets are running actions and Kevin Durant's on the floor. And it's very clear that in every action, the defense is keying in on Kevin Durant, and it's opening windows that we've always known that Alperen Sengun can punish. But now those windows are wider, and it's giving Sengun the opportunity to actually use that passing and do it. Was something that we talked about last season, how it seemed like Sengun's passing had kind of regressed some, not the flashy types of passes that we used to see, a lot of forced stuff. And I think from a team perspective, everybody being crisper with cuts, everybody noticing that Kevin Durant's warping the floor attention-wise and moving it and then taking advantage of it, even if it's a preseason game, to me was one of the biggest takeaways.
Let me jump in real quick. There's a comment related to that from Rob Dover over on Blue Sky that I think speaks to exactly what you're getting at. He had a thread of observations, and regarding Kevin specifically, he says it took KD a little bit to get comfortable, but once he got in, he looked great. Loved his decision-making. He did a great job keeping the advantage on offense. Sometimes that was rising up to shoot. Sometimes that was a quick pass. He had a glorious touch pass to Reed Shepherd at one point. The obvious answer to how Durant helps is as a tough shot maker at the end of the clock, but I think how he might help more is by just finding a decisive advantage before they get there. It was noticeable how much more rare those late shot clock situations were in this game, though it might have been the Utah defense to some extent. Now, I thought that was a really astute observation because I sort of thought the same thing. We all, in our minds, thought back to last season and the difficult looks that Fred and Jalen weren't frequently able to convert. But what it looked like in this game, and maybe it becomes more difficult against better defenses, but I was just struck by how, as you mentioned, Paulo, how much more crisp it was, and that it didn't get to those late shot clock situations because they were generating advantages much earlier, as opposed to last year. You talked about it. There weren't really, especially outside of Alperen Sengun, and when you only have one advantage generator, it's very easy for defenses to key in on him. They just weren't able to generate many advantages, and that's why there were so many late shot clock situations in the first place, where Fred or Jalen just sort of had to heave something up. Whereas last night, because you had multiple top-tier advantage generators, everything went much more smoothly. Does that sort of get at what you were describing in your first comments?
Yeah, I think it's basically that the fact that Kevin Durant's on the floor, whether with the ball or without the ball, is drawing so much attention that windows that last year were small or non-existent now are a lot easier for us to take advantage of, and we are taking advantage of them. And I think that's just massive for the offense as a whole, because a lot of people thought about this team, and obviously still talking about from a surface level, a lot of people thought about this team, oh, okay, Kevin Durant's getting surrounded by like four great defenders on any given possession, and they're going to be the best defense in the league, and then they're gonna hope that Kevin Durant can provide them a better offense by himself than what they had last season. And what I saw last night and against the Hawks as well, more so last night with KD, is that he is such a huge presence, and he is so respected that this team might not be a middle of the pack or like a 10th in the league level offense with a top 3 or 4 defense. No, this team might be a dynamic offensive team that is able to steamroll opponents. And I mean, against the Jazz, obviously it's the Jazz, but they were really hot. And the Rockets were more than able to just keep up with them offensively while they were shooting 60% from the floor. And at the same time, once the Jazz got close enough, the Rockets would lock in on defense, build an air pocket, I guess, or a significant lead, and then go back to the fun offensive style that they were playing. Like, it feels like, and I think that's a level of greatness that's kind of a really good team, which is like the Rockets last season to win had to be locked in 100% of the time. What they showed, particularly in the Jazz game, was that, okay, this might be a dynamic offensive team that has the ability to lock in defensively whenever the lead is threatened. Because it never really felt like the Jazz were going to win the game. It felt like they would come closer, but the Rockets had just an overwhelming amount of talent, even offensively. And so when they locked in defensively, it was just there's no chance the Jazz are ever going to win. And I'm not even saying that that's going to be their identity going into the season, because I don't believe that's Ime Udoka at all. But it goes to show, like, last season, it felt like the Rockets milked not every single, but more like 80 or 60 or 70% of the wins that they could get. This season, it feels like, okay, the talent level is a lot higher. I think they'll struggle less to win. And at the same time, the ceiling is also really high, because when they do walk in and they do show the type of defensive attitude that they had last season, it's obviously off of 2 preseason games, but just projecting how this team could look like this might not be the same underdog, really hardworking team that needs to solve every single defensive possession to be able to sustain being in front of the other team. No, this might be a team that is actually really good offensively as well, and can decide when to, dig their heel into the opposing team's neck or whatever it may be. To me, it felt like, and it also felt like, even without Fred VanVleet and even without Dorian Finney-Smith, it felt like the depth was just insane. The third stringers the Rockets were playing out there were handily beating the Jazz and their, some players from their first 5 and players from their second 5 as well. Like, the Rockets went away from their starters very early on and just kept building a lead. So I think it's just 2 games, but we might have been a little bit wrong about what the identity of this team is, and kind of underestimated, depending on how, obviously, guys were shooting well, and who knows if that's going to translate. And we'll talk about players individually, of course. But it really felt like, okay, the identity of this team might not just be scrappy underdog with a superstar that's going to carry them offensively. There might be more to them offensively than that. And, I'll leave it open to you if you want to touch on any specific player yourself,
Yeah.
but we can go into that.
Well, I think this is an interesting day to have that conversation, because after Wednesday night's game, when I recorded the post-game show with Dave Hardesty, Dave mentioned that same line of thinking regarding the identity. Is it going to shift from last year when they were a top 5 defense throughout, at times a top 2 or top 3 defense, and just a middle of the pack offense, even worse than that in half court situations? We expected it to improve some with Kevin Durant, but there's people talking today, Kendrick Perkins, on ESPN said that with Kevin Durant, the Rockets could be the best offense in the NBA. Now, we're just 2 games into the preseason, so it's probably premature to say that. But with what we saw against the Utah Jazz, you can't say that it's entirely crazy either. And so that's why I'm sort of curious to see what happens these 2 preseason games against the Pelicans and the Hawks next week. The Hawks, because I think they're a team that's, gave the Rockets some problems defensively because of their length, obviously Dyson Daniels. So do Amen Thompson and Reed Shepherd look better? That's one of my big questions. I thought between game 1 and game 2, there was so much growth from both Amen and Reed, and the easy thing you can attribute it to, and I hope it's this, is the presence of Kevin Durant, because I don't think I'm in a half-court situation is ready to be a top 2 creator for a contending level team. But if you slide him down to third behind 2 guys who can be the engine in half-court situations, which Kevin and Alperen certainly can be, then the floor opens up for him. And similarly with Reed at 21 years old, I don't know if you want him to be maybe your third best creator amongst your starting lineup, but if you slide him down to fourth or fifth and he's getting much more advantaged scenarios, then it starts to make a lot more sense. And so that's what I want to see, especially in this rematch with the Hawks, in which both teams might take it as the dress rehearsal of sorts, because while it's the last preseason game, it is 5, 6, 7 games or 7 days, excuse me, before each team opens the regular season. 6 days in the Rockets' case, because they have that opening night game at Oklahoma City. So there's enough of a gap to where I don't think coaches will be too hesitant based on the injury risk factor. I think they'll want to get their guys some real opportunities. And so against a team that's pretty good and has a lot of defenders that gave the Rockets at times in that first game problems, especially Reed and the men with the turnovers, I'm curious to see how much of that resolves just with Kevin Durant being out there, or was it a combination of having Kevin Durant and facing an opponent yesterday in the Utah Jazz that was extremely young and thus didn't have the high level of defense, the ball pressure to really take them out of their comfort zone. I lean to it being more Kevin Durant, but to me, that's the big question, because besides what Kevin brought individually, I just thought between game 1 and game 2, there was so much progression from Amen and Reed. And if you get the version of especially Amen, but Reed played pretty well as well in that second game against the Jazz, that it's hard not to imagine this offense being, really, really good, like top 5 in the league good, even if I still think Perk might be overcooking it a little bit with number 1 in the league. But yeah, if you get last night's version of Amen and Reed, I could see this offense being elite. To me, the big question is whether that's truly sustainable, how much of it is specifically because of the Jazz, and obviously they didn't have some of their best defenders, most notably Walker Kessler. That's a bad team to begin with. So those are my thoughts. It all comes down to Amen and Reed. We knew that when Fred went out, those were the 2 variables that were going to become even more important, especially in the half court. I liked what we saw against the Jazz. I do want to see how sustainable it is against tougher competition. I guess that's my view of how elite this offense can be. I think it's largely going to hinge on those 2 guys.
Yeah, and while I do agree with you, obviously the Jazz are not, the measuring stick for a team like the Rockets. I just gotta say it at the same time, like they made 17 threes through the first 3 quarters, which is the time that the Rockets hit their like main guys. Like that's an insane. Like they were really hot shooting the ball, and it still never really felt like that the game was in danger. It really felt like the Rockets were kind of playing around with them. And since you started going on the individual guys, I guess I'll touch on the same guys that you touched on. Reed Shepard definitely looks a lot more confident, and obviously shots are going in, which is the biggest deal with him. And he and really confident shots as well, like off of movement and stuff like that. It doesn't seem as scared as he looked before. So the confidence that everybody's talking about is definitely there. There were a few turnovers there from just throwing the ball away. I think they were even on top of each other. And, that's gonna happen. It's a preseason game, they were clearly a little bit more relaxed out there, and so I can understand why that happened. But talking about those 2 in specific, I think Reed has improved on defense. I think that's a no-brainer. On offense, he seems very, very poised in the same ways that he was already before. I saw some encouraging stuff of him getting to the rim, and no, obviously that's good as well. Obviously, the confidence shooting the free. I'm more confident, obviously small sample size, I'm more confident than I was before the season about him potentially actually being a key role player for the team, potentially even starting. I mean, we had the full lineup except for Steven Adams last game, and he was the starter, so we'll see how that progresses. But
He started in both games, by the way. I was going to ask you about that. They talked about it. Maybe we'll see something change next week, but we are now 50% through the preseason sample, and Reed has started both games. They have not started the double big in either, so I won't say anything's a lock. They did start Tari when Kevin was out, but A, I think it was just because Kevin was sitting out, and B, I don't think Tari has looked He hasn't looked bad, but he hasn't particularly looked great either. So as of now, it looks to me like Reed Shepherd is the favorite for that fifth starting spot.
I struggle with taking maybe the starters you can take more from, but as far as rotation patterns go, it's just like I don't think it's projectable at all from what they did in these two preseason games and what's eventually going to happen. The starting lineup might be correct. I think that's something that's more easy to take away or easier to take away. But as far as rotation patterns, the way they use the three bigs and how that's gonna work, it's hard to see on a 3-quarter game because in preseason you're not worried about who's getting the minutes and you're likely like I don't think they're going to play a guy just to play him 5 minutes a game. I mean they might. Maybe that's something that's new, but I struggle to see them do that. But moving on to next guy, Amen Thompson. I think there's massive improvement here. And I think a lot of people aren't giving it the credit it deserves. Like I think the handle looks a lot better. And yes, he had some turnovers. Yes, he had some situations where he mishandled the ball, but he's attempting to do stuff that he was not attempting to do last season with the ball in his hands. He's not picking up the dribble nearly as much. He's a lot more confident. And at the same time, there were a lot of situations where last year's a man would even potentially get through the first layer of the defense, but then get to the rim and have to settle for a floater or have to turn back. That in these two preseason games, he has gotten all the way to the rim. He's had some nice finishes as well, not just in transition, in the half court as well. And I think that he has mixed that in with his offense from last year, which was a lot of cutting, a lot of grabbing offensive rebounds, a lot of being in the dunker spot. I think it's good that we're going to see him used in the way he was last season, as well as mixing in some of what he's been doing this season with the handle, because that gives him kind of a floor from a confidence perspective. Like he's not going to start a game like 1 for 10. He's likely going if he's having a bad game, he might miss the first 5 shots that he takes. But at the same time, mixed in with those will be 4 cuts that end up being done, or maybe an offensive rebound, or maybe a situation where he's in the dunker spot and the ball gets dumped off to him. Like I think that mix is something that makes me really happy because a lot of the time when you thrust players into a bigger offensive role, they forget or they stop doing what they did before they had the talent to be thrust into that main ball handler offensive role. So I'm really happy that that's something that we are seeing with him. And, obviously a really small sample, but those threes looked good. They looked confident. Some of them were contested, and one of them was contested at least, and he shot them anyway. So as far as the man Thompson goes, like we saw it in smaller volume in game one, in game two on a higher volume. Like not only do I think there's a massive step with the handle, I think he's going to absolutely feast on the gravity that KD has, especially because of how good he is as a decision maker and how good he's showing to be at punishing and taking advantage of that space, that connector type role that we see, with guys like Aaron Gordon and stuff like that, like with KD on the floor and with the sort of spacing, a lot more opportunities are rising for Amen Thompson to do exactly that. We already saw some of it last season. A lot of it had to be through offensive rebounding because the offense didn't have any space. But now, like we're seeing a lot of easier stuff come to him because of that space. So as far as those two guys, those are my main takeaways. Like I think it's a massive improvement in him, especially as far as eventually becoming an on-ball start for a man. I think that has really improved. And as far as Reed Shepherd, I think a lot of D grades in his game have been upgraded to C and potentially, maybe even B minus grades within his game. So, we'll see how this translates into real NBA games. But I think a lot of people weren't too excited about those two, but I definitely took them as both as, pretty clear positive through preseason.
And let me follow up on Amen because I think, there's this discussion today about the turnovers. And I understand why, because there were a few of the live ball variety, especially against the Hawks. There were too many. And we saw that a little bit in the first quarter, particularly against the Jazz. And some of the threes they gave up were because the Jazz had 4-on-2 transition situations. And a lot of the reaction just because, as you mentioned, the Jazz were white hot and just made pretty much everything. If they shoot 35%, the Rockets win by 25, and we're having an entirely different conversation today. But some of the turnovers, in my opinion, occurred because the Rockets are trying to play at a higher pace, and that benefits the men and it benefits the offense overall. We've talked the last 2 years about Ime and the coaching staff. They've said they want to play faster, and then for various reasons, it just didn't happen. And in my opinion, some of these turnovers are just a byproduct of picking up the pace, trying to make decisions much more quickly. And so I'm not saying there's nothing to the idea that maybe they're too turnover prone. I think it'll definitely be something that they talk about in the film room. And without Fred VanVleet, I do think that you have to sort of keep a watchful eye on it. But I think some of it's just they're inherently going to have a few more turnovers because especially if a men is running the show and they're moving much more quickly than we're used to the last couple of years under Fred, that inherently leads to a few more turnovers. And it doesn't look great at times, but if the overall pace is faster and you're getting much more offensive productivity as a result of it, then you'll take the trade-off, right? I mean, I'm not saying it 100% is worth it. Obviously, we have to see just how sustainable this offense is, but taking the Jazz game as an example, I don't know how much you can really complain about the turnovers if you put up 140 points on elite efficiency for the game. You see where I'm going with that?
Yeah, and again, I think that I'm with you, and I think this is what you're saying as well. But I think the turnover thing is overblown. Like they have 13 turnovers against the Cavs. That's not a lot, especially for the amount of possessions that were played. And then against the Hawks, they did have 19 turnovers, but Amen had three. Like it's not like I know it wasn't a lot of minutes played, but three turnovers is nothing like that crazy for what's considered a bad game. Like I don't think it's so alarming at all, and I think it's something that's very easily fixable. If it's not working, like if you're turning the ball over in the game, like you have Kevin Durant on your team, you have Alperen Sengun who's been a lot safer with the ball this preseason. Like I don't think it's like if you feel like it's getting out of control, you have measures and you have players in place that can immediately put a stop to that. And in the meantime, like let them it's also a preseason game. They're trying stuff out. Like it's not as structured as it's going to be in season. So yeah, I'm definitely with you. I think the turnovers thing was a bit overblown, and there were just some turnovers that was just being careless with the ball, and a lot of them were like, let's be real, the team was not absolutely locked into both games, and they easily won both of them. Like it's not like complaining about turnovers in the preseason to me seems kind of pointless because the preseason is exactly made to try stuff out, and it's guys playing rotations that are not exactly what they're going to play with in the season, and especially so because the Rockets were winning, and it's not like it was a very low pressure environment, and it was a very experimental type of game, and they were trying a lot of different stuff. And there's also the very normal argument of guys are building chemistry with each other. Guys are learning how the others like to get the ball. Like it's not. I don't think it's like we're seeing different, and even within the guys that were already in the team, like their games do not look the same. And we haven't talked about Jabari Smith Jr., but him, for example, like he's playing basically nothing like he played last year.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's actually somewhat correlated with the men's success because I think one of the problems the last couple of years has been the lack of off-ball movement. And when we talk about running shin hub as we did in our most recent or maybe second most recent pod, and I don't want to get bogged down in semantics, not necessarily referring to exactly the Nikola Jokic template, but just the idea that you can unlock more out of Alperen Sengun as a facilitator, which clearly to this point they have against the Jazz. He had 13 points, 13 assists, to just one turnover in 28 minutes, which is just insane efficiency as a playmaker. And one of the reasons I think they've struggled at times to do that the last 2 years is Amen is the only guy that consistently moved off the ball. And so it put Sengun in a fairly difficult spot because defenses really only had to account for one off-ball mover, and Amen didn't even consistently start until midway through last season. Well, now you've got two off-ball movers in Amen and Jabari. I suspect that's part of what you were getting at because for me, it's been night and day watching how decisively Jabari moves off the ball compared to a year ago. And I think some of it is just feeling much more comfortable in his role. I think one of the issues the last couple of years, I suppose Sengun is the one exception, and it probably took midway through Ime Udoka's first season to reach this point. Sengun's the one exception where there was a clear star, or at least star in the making. And then beyond Sengun, there's been a lot of hoping and praying, and that the other members of your core six, even core seven, you give them a lot of runway, you see who can develop, and everybody has a few moments over 82 games. The question is how sustainable they are. And I think with Jabari, there's been sort of this back and forth as far as exactly what his role is, exactly what they're looking for and need out of him. And when you're drafted number 3 overall, it's easy to look at his profile and say, hey, if he develops in certain areas, this could potentially be a star. Whereas this year, you've got two clear alphas in Kevin Durant and Alperen Sengun, in the half court, that is. You've got three clear alphas, counting them in when you factor in transition and defense. And so it's much more easy for Jabari to sort of focus on his specific role, as opposed to going back and forth between how much do I want to create, how much am I looking for certain spots on the floor. I think he's much more confident in what he needs to do for this team to win. And so because of that, not only is it beneficial to him because he's getting some easy shots and getting into advantage spots based on this off-ball movement, but I also think it's helpful to Amin because now Amin's not the only guy cutting. And of course, Sengun, now he's got multiple cutters. So the fact that both Amin and Jabari are much more, well, I shouldn't say both are much more comfortable because Amin already was, but the fact that you now have two guys rather than one that are comfortable doing this off-ball movement in a scheme where you have two top-shelf half-court guys in Kevin and Sengun, that makes you much more dynamic as an overall team. And so I'm guessing that's part of what you've seen from Jabari. I don't think that's the only change, but I think it's one that is correlated with the men's success, and it's one that's potentially helping unlock the best version of Alperen Sengun as well.
No, it's 100%. No, it's 80% that. Like, he definitely seems a lot more decisive, and I think it's both off the ball and on the ball as well. Like, he is going for pull-up threes with confidence. Like, he is putting the ball on the floor, and there's obviously that dunk that he had that was pretty impressive against the Hawks. But with him, like, it's just being decisive, getting into even post position at times. I think, and sometimes I'm guilty of this as well, not really with the players on my team, but mostly players on other teams in the league, is, hey, if you're a really good role guy, like, don't try to be more than that. It's not going to pay off over time because you're going to be wasting shots. Well, we're developing guys, right? And with Jabari in specific, when he came into the league, there was a baseline of, competency on the ball, both putting the ball on the floor and getting to his own shot, that just wasn't there. And I think we're seeing the payoff of, and he said that during the offseason, he was working on his offense and working on generating his own shot. And we see the payoff of that, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to give him the ball in the perimeter and let him go to work like he's KD every single time. But working on that makes the simpler stuff a lot easier. Like, you're way past the point where, he's just a guy that you can trust to, sit in the perimeter and catch and shoot shots. And then sometimes, maybe take a couple of dribbles and then pull up again, or maybe try to attack the closeoff, but then get to the rim and not really know what to do. Like, I think there's definitely been a lot of progress during the season with that for Jabari. We already saw some of it last season. I think there's been a step up this season. And at the same time, to me, he just seems a bit more athletic. Like, Jabari was really tall, could easily dunk. Him dunking was never a problem, but he's getting up there. Like, that dunk he had, like, I don't think I've ever seen him in game jump that high for a dunk. Like, yeah, I think he's always been 6'10", 6'11", but he was pretty flat-footed even coming out of college. And I think there's been a step up in athleticism. And then as far as in game, you talked about the off the ball stuff. And this is kind of off the ball as well, but I mean, coming off of screens and shooting shots, like pulling up or shooting, not really movement, because he gets set most of the time before shooting. But we saw like more of that. Like, we saw more of him looking for his own shot. We saw him be confident. We saw him like not second guess, like, oh, shoot the ball, go to Fred, Sengun, and Jalen Green before I actually attempt my shot. Like, I feel like there was a lot more confidence from him that he can do this as well. Like, he can generate offense as well. And I think it's paid dividends, and I think it's going to do wonders for him to play with KD for an extended period of time, working with him every day. And I think a lot of people have put a ceiling on Jabari and saying, hey, like he's going to be a 3-and-D role player that's really switchable. And that's really useful. And I think he'll definitely be that. But I'm not quite ready to quit on him being maybe a little bit more than that. Maybe a little bit more Michael Porter Jr.-esque with obviously better defense. Like I think there's still a world out there where he can be that. And I think he just started off his career at a lot lower of a point than people gave it credit for because his college stats looked so good and his efficiency looked so good. I think he was just in a perfect position to succeed against less physical players. And I think rookie Jabari Smith Jr. was a lot worse than people give it credit for. And so they think he's kind of stagnated or improved very little over the past, at this point, 3 years, going into the fourth now. And I don't think that's true. I think he improved a lot on a lot of things, but it's just that the baseline was so low before that him improving on those made him a much better player, but doesn't necessarily show up in the stat sheet. It shows up when you look at him play. So as far as Jabari, I think he's definitely gotten a lot better. And I'll move on to, I guess you touched on him. So, and we still got to talk about KD, Alperen Sengun, Taro Eason. I mean, we could talk about a lot of guys, but I guess I'll leave your guy to you because I think on this pod he can be considered your guy. So I'm gonna leave that to you. I'll let you talk about him later, and I'm pretty sure you know who I'm talking about.
Yes, Shady Davison fan club. Yeah,
Exactly. So I guess I'll go quickly through the other guys. I think Josh Okogie looked completely lost on defense in game one. He drew a couple of 3-point shooting fouls. I mean, he showed some flashes of one-on-one defense at certain points. Obviously it's a minimum guy, like there's not a lot of risk there, but wasn't too impressed. Capela, man, it just feels so good to have him in a Rockets jersey again. Like he was one of my favorite players when I started watching the Rockets. Like we saw him grow, and he's just a vet now. And his chemistry with Sengun is going to be crazy. I think people are talking about, the meme of the lob threat for Jalen Green, like, oh, Jalen needs a lob threat, needs vertical spacing. Listen, Alperen Sengun can do some pretty nice things, as we saw with a vertical spacer as well, or even, I mean, we saw it with Ime Thompson last year. Like Sengun is perfectly capable of feeding the dunker spot as a center, or feeding the dunker spot as a center, and finding Clint Capela as a rim runner. Like rim running doesn't necessarily mean setting a pick and rolling and stuff like that. Right? Or a rim runner, like cutting is rim running as well. And I think Clint Capela brings a dimension to this offense that we don't quite have. Was not so impressed with him on defense. I know he had a couple of blocks there or a stretch of like 2 or 3 minutes where he had, a couple of highlight plays. But I also felt at times that as big as he is, could be a bit more of a deterrent. But then again, it's preseason, so can't really, complain too much about that. But yeah, happy to have Clint. I think he'll play more than people expect. And I think he's one of those guys that just a completely different skill set that will be important as we go into the season. Jeff Green's not worth talking about. I mean, the biggest news for him is that we know that he wants to play one more year. Aaron Holiday, to me, strikes me as I think he knows he's not going to play much to begin the season. And when he was asked about the other guys, I think he very much accepted that and was trying to put the spotlight on them. But he is still a very useful player. And then I guess I'll talk about the two main guys. I think with KD, KD is KD, right? So what are you going to do about it? Well, I already talked about his gravity. I think that was a huge thing. And I was not really impressed, but kind of surprised about how comfortable he was just not having the ball in his hands. And we went like stretches of 2, 3, 4 minutes where KD doesn't touch the ball or doesn't, get a nice possession on offense. And I was surprised by that. I thought they would go to him a little bit more. I think he got a lot of his buckets just in the flow of the offense, in the flow of the actions that we already ran last year with the dribble handoffs. And I know he talked about it post-game, or I don't know if it was post-game or an interview today. I just saw the quotes about how, those actions help him get to spots that he's comfortable at on the floor. And yeah, I was positively surprised by, it was never going to be James Harden in the sense that he's just, tuned off unless he has the ball in his hands to ISO, like when James was in Houston. But he was actively using his gravity to open space up for others, and he was ready to go immediately when he got the ball. And he got a lot of buckets in the same ways that Ace Bailey got. his buckets at the time, which was just, within the flow of the offense. And this doesn't mean that KD's not perfectly capable of isoing. He did so a few times in the game, but he's also capable of doing everything else, which is why it's different acquiring Kevin Durant versus acquiring other high usage superstars, because KD can fit into anything. And beyond that, and I was just really happy to see the guy run on the fast break, run back defensively. Like, this is a preseason game, and Kevin Durant's like setting the example. Like, he's not slacking off, letting the other the other four younger dudes on the court do the defense for him. No, not at all. Quite the opposite. Like, he was sometimes hustling more than some of the young guys. And I did notice that because, first time watching KD with the Rockets cheers, you're kind of looking at him all the time, and you notice these little things that he still does, even at the age that he has now. I don't know if you want to touch on KD before we move on to Sengun, or if you saw something else from him.
No, we can move to Sengun.
All right. And then as far as Sengun goes, I saw a couple of mental lapses defensively, like defensive mistakes, but I think that's just comes from, it's a preseason game. I think the touch is definitely there. He made a couple of contested shots, like straight net, doesn't even touch the rim. And I was really impressed with his flow and how fluid it was. He's always been fluid, but last season felt like contact was bothering him a lot more. But perhaps because he was trying to finish through so much contact last season, now it kind of feels like the shackles are off. And, even when there's a little bit of contact, it doesn't really bother him because of what he had to play through last season. But it definitely feels like Sengun's here for that superstar leap. And I do think it will be a question at the end of the season who the best player on the Rockets is. And the Rockets have Kevin freaking Durant, as Rafael Stone says. But Sengun just looked insanely impressive, both setting up the offense, running the offense as a point guard, not necessarily Shen Hub, but even from the top of the key, like, not necessarily what you think of when you think about Shen Hub, which is him having the ball in the post and guys cutting around him. No, he was doing that like true point guard, big, at the top of the key, doing all of that stuff. So definitely impressed with that. He shot some threes. He made some threes. If that's a part of his game as well, watch out. But yeah, it just felt like the freedom Alperen Sengun played with back when we were tanking. It felt like he was making the same, like that magic came back. Like, he's doing that same type of stuff. Just our team has much higher expectations and much higher responsibility. And if Sengun is able to play that free in season and be as competent as he was, these last two games, watch out. Like, he might be in the conversation for the best player on the Rockets when that time comes, or when inevitably the media wants to talk about it, because I think he's really that good. And it feels like, even though the Kevin Durant's on the team, like, Sengun's the main guy, and we intentionally give him the ball more than we intentionally gave the ball to Kevin Durant. And I think KD is going to get, obviously, a lot of touches, mainly in the clutch, of course, and we're going to force feed him the ball a bit as well. But it feels like every possession has to go through Sengun, and I think that's the correct way to approach building our offense. And it really feels like what he was doing in Eurobasket has definitely carried over.
All right, I'll finish up the pod talking about three guys that I don't think we've talked a lot about, because I think there's some interconnected nature to the decisions with regards to, obviously, J.D. Davison. You were saving that for me, versus Aaron Holiday, and also the roles of Steven Adams and Tari Eason, because I think what you need off the bench is potentially shifting. I thought it was very noteworthy that in game 2, Davison played ahead of Josh Okogie, who I agree, especially his off-ball defense in that game against the Hawks, was not very good. We didn't see Okogie until the second half against the Jazz. So Davison got an earlier look in the game. By the way, he was plus 17 in his 17 minutes, I believe, best of any player on the floor. He's looked very good. And is he going to play? I think a lot of it comes down to exactly what you need out of that 10 to 15 minutes per game guard spot off the bench. A lot of people have it earmarked for Aaron Holiday, and one reason that I think a lot of people were going in that direction is that for an offensively challenged team the last couple of years, if there has been any injury or any issue at all, then having a guy you could trust to shoot 40%, even if he's a little bit on the small side, if he shoots 40% on threes, it's probably worth playing him, because it's a team that was so limited elsewhere. However, if you are able to score at an elite level and in the half court, as this year's team is, the calculus might change. And that's where I could see J.D. Davison coming into play, because Davison is much more dynamic. Now, I don't think his three-point shooting is as bad as a lot of people do. I've seen people citing his G League numbers. Actually, last year, he shot, when you factor in the G League regular season, the tip-off tournament, and the playoffs, about a 50-game sample, he was 34.5%. And that was as the star player for the Maine Celtics. In other words, at volume, he would probably shoot a little bit higher if he was playing in a complementary role, which you are if you're the ninth man in an NBA rotation and getting cleaner looks off of players like Alperen Sengun and Kevin Durant. So I think there's a world where he could be passable from a three-point perspective, but he's still not going to be Aaron Holiday at 40%. So I want to acknowledge that off the top. I don't think his shooting is as bad as some fear. It was a liability if you look back to his college days and AAU. I do think there are clear signs that he's made real improvements, not to the Aaron Holiday standard, but I also don't think he's going to be like a sub 30%. I think you can count on him to at least be, low to mid 30s from three, and maybe a smidge higher than that if you get lucky and some of these changes he has made prove to be sustainable, especially if he's getting a much higher percentage of clean looks as opposed to when he's the guy on the Maine Celtics. And so if the three-point gap isn't massive, I think it's something, but I don't think it's massive between Holiday and Davison, then Davison just gives you so much more in other areas. He's more athletic, he's bigger, he's thicker, he can do more things when he's handling the ball in the pick and rolls. It just comes down to what you need. And the last 2 years, they have been so devoid of shooting that a lot of times you had no choice but to put in the guy who not only shoots 40% on threes, but also helps space the floor because you are so devoid of talent elsewhere that you need every advantage that you can get. Well, if you are getting those advantages elsewhere, then you can think a little more aggressively. And I do think JD has more to his game than Aaron Holiday does. And he also, on some nights, might have more than Reed Shepherd. I think Reed in year two is going to be a little matchup dependent. And JD, with the athleticism and how thick he is, has the potential to perhaps excel in some matchups where Reed is a little too small. And so I think he could be a useful hedge there. And so, yeah, there is a world where J.D. Davison can play. I'm not saying for sure it will happen. I do think Ime likes and trusts Aaron Holiday. But if you start to think bigger picture, maybe the model this year is different than it is the last 2 years. Well, it certainly is. But maybe that changes how you evaluate those end of the bench and end of the rotation spots. And I also think some of that applies to Steven Adams and Tari Eason as well. Look, Steven Adams is not a guy that you're going to tell a lot from in the preseason, but I do think that Steven was so important to this team late last season and in the playoffs because of how offensively deficient they were in the half court. So you needed every margin advantage when it comes to the screen setting, the offensive glass, everything that Steven provides. Well, if you are able to generate offense on a much more consistent basis, do you need the double big as much as you did last year? I think that's part of why the Rockets want to start Reed Shepherd. I don't think they want the double big to be, they certainly still want to do it, and I think they view matchups where it will help them, but I don't know if it's going to be every single game. And so sometimes it's going to come to a situation on whether it's Steven or whether it's Tari. And I'm sort of torn. Tari hasn't shot the ball well from three, but other than that, he seems to be moving much better than he did a year ago. He said he feels much healthier. We've seen him when he's in the game taking much more of the point of attack responsibility defensively like he did before re-injuring the leg last year. And so maybe there's going to be some matchups where instead of Steven or Capela getting leaned on with Sengun, instead you want to go more versatile. Let Tari do some of the heavy lifting defensively, and in turn, you can save a little bit of juice for men on the offensive end of the floor. So with Tari, it's been a mixed bag, and I do think we need to see him shoot better from three. 20% through 2 games is not ideal, obviously a small sample, but defensively, I do think he's looked a little springier. He's looked closer than I remember in a while to what he was prior to the leg issues, and so I'm not forming a conclusion just yet because obviously it's really early, but I do think there's going to be an interesting decision for Ime in a lot of these matchups. Do you want to go with the double big, or do you want to give Tari the opportunity to play 25 to 30 minutes and be the guy that, he clearly thinks he can be? If you listen to Tari at training camp, he's gone out of his way multiple times to say he wants more minutes, he wants more opportunities, he wants a bigger role. In other words, the 20 to 25 minutes per game that he's played the last couple of years. he thinks he deserves more than that. He can get a contract extension up until October 20th. So in the preseason and training camp and in these practices in between, he's obviously playing for that. I'm not saying there's a clear answer because Steven Adams in particular is a really good player in his own right. But I don't know, just the fact that offense is going to come much more freely and easily for this group allows you to think a little more strategically than you could have a few months ago. And so I guess where I'm going with all of this, if it's a few months ago, you play Aaron Holiday and Steven Adams no matter what, because those are two really high floor players, and you needed high floor players in a situation like last year where you were elite defensively, but just trying to be passable enough offensively to get by. Now, all of a sudden, you can think a little bit more strategically, and that might lead to some more opportunities, certainly for Tari Eason, but maybe to a lesser extent for J.D. Davison as well. That's my thoughts on the end of rotation decisions. Paulo, what are your thoughts about those dynamics as you evaluate, how to use those types of players?
Yeah, I think I don't wanna damp on your on your excitement, but I do think the ceiling for JD Davison is probably taking over whatever role Aaron Holiday is going to have. And even then, there's so
Right, but I'm saying you can potentially do that now, whereas last year I don't think you could have.
Yes, you can take that risk now in a much more significant way, and we still need to see if the shooting that we've had these past couple of games is actually real. Because a man shot really well, Jabari Smith shot really well, and Sengun also shot very well. But I do think there might be more to JD Davison than we thought, and we've talked about this over other two-way guys, especially in moments where we see them play a lot and there's not much to talk about. But he might be the classic, take that I always have, which is, the guy you sign on a two-way deal as a contender that eventually turns into a valuable role player on a minimum contract. I mean, I'll shout out my guy, Nemias Queta from Portugal on the Celtics. He was a two-way guy for a really long time until they signed him to a very cheap 4-year minimum deal. JD Davison might be a guy like that, and this year he might not, he might show enough to want a deal like that, but at the same time not get that much playing time and sign that deal, right? That 4-year non-guaranteed with team options and all that stuff, and still be really, really valuable in a couple of years when Thompson's getting paid and you don't have the depth that you have right now. I think that was another takeaway from the preseason is our depth is insane and we have two injured guys. But I did see dude's a bowler. And it's really as simple as that. He tries hard on defense and he made his 3-point shots. And at that point, what else can you ask from him really? His only deficiency really is not being, 6'5". So we'll see how he plays going into the season. The more interesting question is the Tari Easton question. And Tari, I saw some encouraging stuff as far as decision making goes. I saw some encouraging stuff as far as how crafty he was finishing at the rim. He was legit finishing better than what we saw Jalen Green finish last season around the rim, and as far as his craft goes. At the same time, I don't know how I feel about him saying that he wants a bigger role, because I don't know what he means by bigger role. I know we're assuming he means more minutes. I'm hoping it doesn't mean he wants more shots or he wants to self-create more, because, well, he does have some of that upside. I think we saw even in preseason that, he struggles with that a little bit. And capitalizing on an advantage that someone else creates for you, whether through, a long closeout or something like that, is one thing. Getting the ball on the floor, going through screens and stuff like that is a completely different thing. But we won't know until the season plays out. And we won't know until an extension either gets done or doesn't get done. But it's definitely not a green flag, is what I would say. As far as how he's used, I think the fact that Dorian Finney-Smith is not currently available is going to do a lot, or is going to solve a lot of problems that the Rockets are going to have when he eventually is available, as far as how Tari Eason's role looks, how they manage the double big lineups. Because I do think even though the double big lineups don't really, the guys play clearly different positions, if you run more double big lineup, there's less space for the wings like Tari Eason, Jabari Smith, and Dorian Finney-Smith to play. So going into the season, we're obviously going to see more Tari Eason, and I think how he plays is largely going to dictate what we see moving forward, because especially if the Rockets don't sign that extension, or if Rockets and Tari don't reach that extension, you might reach a situation that's kind of complicated, in which well, he didn't sign the extension, so unless he's playing well, there's no real incentive for the Rockets to prioritize him, especially because he's going to hit the free agency market next season, and, the business is the business. But if he does sign that deal, it might make some sense to give him a little bit of a bigger leash. And if he does get that deal, then I think he'll be more settled as far as what he wants his role to be. Like, I think my read on the situation is kind of that he blamed his unhappiness kind of, or tried to, on the NBA top 100 list. It seemed a bit forced to me. I don't think that's why he was kind of upset. I think it might contribute to it, but I don't think that's why he was upset about his role. And I think that's what sparked it, especially because that list has been around for a pretty long time. So all in all, what we can, like, I think the easiest way to solve it is you sign the extension. Tari's probably fine with his role, whatever it may be, because his money's locked up. If that doesn't happen, you gotta hope he plays really well, so he holds on to that spot, and you don't get in a situation where you have an unhappy Tari that he's not playing as many minutes as he wants to play, and at the same time, he's not playing as well as the team wants him to play, and that's kind of a distraction. But yeah, I think that's the prediction I can make going into the season. Once we get to a situation where they're both available, then we can discuss whether and imagine they're both available and both playing well. Then you can get into the discussion of, well, do you do it matchup dependent? Do you look at other positions on the floor, and if Reed's not playing well, perhaps you play bigger? Do you see how well the big double big lineups are going? When you have so many players, there's a lot of ways you can manage the rotation and manipulate things to make space for a certain guy. But to get to that point, we need Tari to either have his extension signed or play well going into the season until Dorian Finney-Smith becomes healthy again. But it's definitely one of the things that could go wrong within the season. It's definitely one of the, more touch and go things that we have, and the more that has potential to generate drama on the team. And I wasn't encouraged about both his reactions to media day and him sometimes trying to force stuff in the preseason games. But that's the reason. Like, he's been doing that for a really long time, so I don't want to read too much into it as well. But once again, Tari is one of my favorite players on the team. My hope is that he signs an extension and then plays well, and that's the best of both worlds.
All right, that's everything on my list. Paulo, is there anything else you wanted to cover before we wrap up?
I mean, I was debating making a Texans joke, but they don't really play this week. This is typically when I do my other sports joke. So, yeah, I guess I got another.
We'll save it
make
for
a Yankees joke, but probably not.
No, we'll save it for next week when the Texans come out of their bye at Seattle. How sweet would it be if the Mariners get booted from the playoffs and then the Texans win at Seattle? That would be really fun because, God, those are the most annoying fans on the planet. Jesus. Anyway, we've gone on for long enough, so we will wrap it here. And as mentioned off the top, we are changing as far as the name, the logo, all of that is still a work in progress. We are now the Rockets Launch Pod, so you'll see some of the branding changing. If you follow us already at your platform of choice, that won't be an issue. But if you need updated intel, just go to the Linktree. Now it's, what is it? It's Linktree with a dot between R and the E /Rockets Launch Pod. And then if you hit up that Linktree, you can get links to the various platforms, Rockets Wire, Sports Talk 790, Clutch Fans, and the aforementioned YouTube live shows. So yeah, in this period of transition, the best way to keep up with us is at that Linktree for the show. And you can find everything that you might need to get more episodes from us, to support our friends, sponsors, all that good stuff. Rockets Launchpod Linktree is the easiest way to do that now until we have everything fully migrated over, which I suspect will occur by the October 21st regular season opener. All right, with that, I will adjourn for today. For Paulo Alves, I'm Ben DuBose. As always, thanks to you guys for listening, and please come back soon for more new episodes of the Rockets Launchpod.